Alright everyone, I'm back to present my next SpongeBob review, which is indeed Squid's Day Off. What happens in this episode is that Squidward is upset that he has to work on such a beautiful day, and he ends up getting upset at SpongeBob to the point where he rages and hits the cash register, which causes all the money from it to fall out. Mr. Krabs, of course, senses the money falling out on the dirty floor and picks it all up and goes to clean it in the sink. Unfortunately, Mr. Krabs accidentally drops a dime inside of the drain and tries to get it out, but ends up getting his hand stuck inside while trying to get the dime out. This makes Mr. Krabs order SpongeBob to help get his hands outside of the drain, and when he eventually gets pulled out, Mr. Krabs ends up flying into a wall, knocking down a lot of items off a shelf, which ends up giving him a concussion and a trip to the hospital. While Mr. Krabs is away, he tells Squidward that he's in charge of the restaurant until he gets back. Squidward, of course, taking full advantage of this situation with him being in charge, decides to give himself the day off, leaving SpongeBob to do his job at the cash register as he goes home for the day off. Squidward at first assumes that SpongeBob would be okay by himself, but slowly realizes all the catastrophes that could happen with leaving SpongeBob alone at the Krusty Krab. First, he thinks about the fact that SpongeBob probably doesn't know how to give people change, so he goes back to make sure, and sure enough, SpongeBob does. After that, he tries to have some time to relax on his day off, but then he soon remembers that SpongeBob could be bored, which could lead to the entire burning of the Krusty Krab. So he goes back with a fire hydrant and sprays the Krusty Krab down just to be safe. After this, he then goes back to his house and keeps telling himself that nothing bad will happen. But Squidward can't get the stress of SpongeBob ruining the restaurant out of his head and runs back constantly to his house into the Krusty Krab until eventually he goes insane. He goes so insane, in fact, that he locks himself inside of his house and attempts to take a shower, but of course, he can't even do this action without getting SpongeBob inside of his head with the concern that SpongeBob will mess up to the point where he thinks that SpongeBob is inside of his house and starts chasing an imaginary SpongeBob back to the Krusty Krab while naked, and when he gets there, he soon realizes SpongeBob has done nothing at all, and it's shortly revealed after that the Krusty Krab was closed the entire time, leaving Squidward deflated. Okay, so I remember liking this episode a lot the last time I saw it, but oh my goodness, I did not expect it to be this good on my next viewing of it. I have so much I want to say about this episode, from the animation to the humor to Squidward himself. It's a lot to unpack, so buckle in, boys and girls. I want to start off by complimenting how amazing this animation is. I know I said my praises in my previous review, but this episode just takes it to another level. Squidward starting off with his normal art style that we all know and love, slowly getting more and more deformed to represent the madness he's gone into, with the stress and paranoia that SpongeBob will eventually mess up, is nothing short of amazing. His facial expressions to show how insane he's gone throughout the day looks horrific, but it's done so well in the scene where he's running back and forth from his house to the Krusty Krab, showing the countless images of SpongeBob inside of his head to reveal how paranoid he's gotten from this whole ordeal. It's super smart. The animation in this episode especially helps express the madness that Squidward has gotten himself into, and it's beautiful. In the end, when he deflates as a result, finding out all the stress was for nothing, was both funny and a lot more meaningful than it might seem at first glance. I'm going to explain what I mean by this soon, but I kind of had to explain the context of my interpretation of the rest of this episode before getting to that point, and before I do that, I have to say Squidward is super relatable in this episode. At first, he thinks that life is going to go his way for once as soon as he's left in charge and realizes he can have the rest of the day off because of this. However, life just doesn't work like that, and Squidward soon realizes all the potential dangers of the scenario he just created is something that can be easily related to, as I'm sure many of us have had the feeling of catastrophic thinking, which is defined as when your brain creates the worst case scenarios, which is fulfilled by anxiety. This feeling is expressed visually and verbally in this episode, which is why I compliment the animation so much, as it gives more perspective about how all these awful things Squidward is thinking that could potentially happen. This psychological battle that Squidward is facing within himself, and you can tell this is negatively affecting him just through the animation alone, with the way his character looks at the end of this episode. This ends off with the deflating scene, which is when Squidward just combusts as he realizes all this built up anxiety and paranoia built up inside of him was all for nothing, as the Krusty Krab was closed, and this scene, while being extremely funny, is also dark if you think about it, as it can reflect how something awful could turn out to be just fine, and you're getting so worked about it just for it not to matter at all, and I'm sure that is the message that is portrayed in this episode. But enough about my fascination with human psychology being reflected upon in a singular SpongeBob episode, and more about another part of this episode that I like, the humor. The humor in this episode, as I explained before, is pretty funny but also dark, with each joke being told in this episode at the expense of Squidward's descent into craziness, which on paper sounds horrendous, but when played out in the episode actually goes pretty well. Squidward fighting this demon of his own mental sanity, while being intriguing to watch, is also funny, as I think Squidward is the perfect character to do this with, as he's often the one being set up in these scenarios, because he's kind of the narcissist, but also the realist one in all of the SpongeBob characters. And the part where he runs naked in the street is especially funny to me, and especially the part where Mr. Krabs gets out of the hospital and then instantly goes back in after the doctor tells him if anything goes wrong, he can go back inside, which he does so, and this moment is one of the funniest moments in the show. There's so much complexity inside of this episode that my peanut brain could barely even describe to you, but I did try and explain my thoughts in the best way I could have in this episode. And it's one of the greatest things I've ever seen in cartoon history with how relatable it is, bringing up dark themes which can only be seen if you look deep enough into it, as catastrophic thinking is something that only seems to be growing for many as the years go on in this world. And it manages to do this all in a very comedic way, which is why I'm going to give Squid's Day Off a flawless 10 out of 10, dethroning Sleepy Time as my new favorite episode of the show so far. Let's see how this episode can hold its reign for, though.